Hello, everybody. So, we are going to be going over 6 vocabulary words from our read aloud this week, A Visitor for Bear by Bonnie Becker. If you have not yet watched that read aloud, I really suggest that you watch it before trying to complete any of these vocabulary activities, because I think it's going to make completing those activities a little bit easier if you've listened to the story and you've already heard these words being used so that you're a little bit more familiar with them. So, if you haven't watched that read aloud yet, you can find it in the assignment that I posted yesterday called Tuesday Making Inferences. Go find that assignment, open it up, and watch that read aloud if you haven't yet, and then come back, okay? But if you have already watched that read aloud, then you're ready to go. So, again, as I said, we're going to be going over some vocabulary words from that story. These are some words that were a little bit on the trickier side. Lucky for you, you didn't actually have to read them because the story was read to you, but maybe you didn't know what these words meant, and that may have kept you from fully understanding what was happening in the story because you didn't really know what they meant. So we're going to be going over what these words mean, and I'm going to be giving you some examples of these words so that hopefully by the end of this, you understand these words and it will help you understand the story a little better. So let's take a look at the first word. The first word from our story is the word impressive. This word means deserving attention. So basically what impressive means, if something is very impressive, it's really cool. Like maybe it's something that not a lot of people can do, or maybe you're doing it better than I thought you could, something like that. If something is very impressive, you are doing a great job. So, for example, your reading was very impressive. I may have even said that to a few of you guys this past week because I've been giving a lot of you reading assessments, and I may have said, wow, your reading was so impressive, or I was very impressed with how well you just did. So, again, impressive means you did a great job. That's something really awesome and cool that you just did. And an example from the story was, I can do a headstand, said Bear. Very impressive, exclaimed the mouse. So that's basically Mouse's way of saying, wow, that's awesome. That's really cool that you can do that headstand. You did a great job. So that is the word impressive. The next word from our story that we're going to talk about is the word rigid. This word means stiff. So a lot of things can be rigid as long as it's a stiff, hard thing. So like a pencil would be considered rigid because it's stiff. You can't bend it or break it very easily. A piece of metal might be stiff. But our bodies can also be rigid. So an example that I gave you was, I was so afraid that my body was rigid. So when I read that sentence, what I picture is, you know how sometimes when you're really afraid, your whole body just like freezes up because you're so afraid and you don't want to move a muscle because you're so scared. That's kind of what I'm picturing here with this sentence. I was so afraid that my body was rigid. It was stiff. It was frozen because I was just so scared. Has that ever happened to you before? That's happened to me before. So that would be an example of rigid. And an example from the story that we read was, Bear pointed a rigid claw toward the door. And I think this almost kind of has two meanings. So not only is a bear's claw rigid because his claws aren't going to move very easily. They're not going to bend or break very easily. It's stiff. But also, remember in the story, Bear was very upset at Mouse. He was angry. He did not want him in his house. So he pointed a rigid claw toward the door. I think that was also the author's way of saying he meant it. He wanted him to get out. He had a stiff claw. He was telling him to get the heck out of his house. So he had a very stiff or rigid claw pointed toward the door. Our next word is attentive. This means to watch carefully. So basically, it just means you're paying very close attention to whatever it is that you're looking at. So an example might be something like, please be attentive during the lesson. So whenever we have a lesson together, or I'm discussing something that we're supposed to be working on in class, if we were in class together and we were on the carpet and I was giving a lesson, I would expect you to be very attentive, which means that not only are you watching me very carefully, but you're just overall paying very close attention to what is happening. You're being a good listener and you're watching very carefully to make sure you don't miss anything and you're staying focused. So an example from the story is the mouse looked most attentive. So again, that just meant that the mouse was looking at the bear very carefully and paying very close attention to what was happening. Attentive. Our next word is venture. This is not a word that you really hear very often, at least not used in this way, but this word means to say something even when you aren't sure about it. So what that basically means is if you venture to say something, you're saying something, but you're not really sure that you believe what you're saying. So an example of that might be, I venture to say that it's raining outside. It's almost kind of like I'm making a guess. I'm guessing, but I'm not totally sure. So if I said, I venture to say that it's raining outside, I don't know for sure that it's raining outside, but I think it might be. So I venture to say that it's raining outside, even though I'm not totally sure if it is or not. So then an example from our story is a crackling fire, ventured the mouse. So the mouse was in search of a crackling fire or to visit the bear inside of his house. But I think the mouse was kind of figuring out that the bear didn't really want him there. So when the mouse asked, do you have a crackling fire? That was the mouse venturing to ask that because he's not sure he's got a crackling fire or that he's going to be willing to share a crackling fire with him because he knows that he knows that the bear doesn't really want him there. So he was saying that, but wasn't really sure about what he was saying or what the answer to that question might be. So venture is almost kind of like a guess, something that you're not quite so sure about, but you're going to say it anyway. All right, next is the word whisk. So there's two meanings for the word whisk. You might have heard of a whisk, like a noun, something that you use to like beat up some eggs in a bowl, or you might whisk together some cake ingredients to make a cake or something. It might be a kitchen tool that you've heard of before. But whisk can also be a verb, which means to move quickly. So if you're going really fast, you might say, you whisked away, or I whisked toward the door, or something like that, moving quickly. So an example might be, I whisked away to lunch because I was so hungry. Have you ever been at school and you're just so hungry that you can't wait to line up and get to the cafeteria because you can't wait to eat? That's kind of what I'm talking about here. So I whisked away to lunch. I went really quickly because I'm so hungry and I can't wait to eat. And an example from our story might be, or is, and the mouse whisked out the door. So that just tells us that the mouse went out the door very quickly, probably because he was a little afraid of the bear. So whisk is to move quickly. And the very last word is intolerable, which means too bad to be accepted. So basically, if something is intolerable, that means it is very, very bad and it is not okay. So an example that came to me really fast was in our classroom. Bullying a classmate is intolerable. So if I found out that anyone was bullying somebody else, that is not going to be accepted. That is intolerable because that is too bad to be accepted. That is not okay. It is not allowed. It is not accepted. It is intolerable. And an example from our book was when Bear said, this is impossible, intolerable, insufferable. That is basically Bear's way of saying that I cannot believe this is happening right now. I do not want this mouse in my house. This is awful and I will not accept it. This is not okay. This is intolerable. I think he might have been being a little bit dramatic, but that's what he meant by this is impossible, intolerable, insufferable. It was not okay with him. Very bad, too bad to be accepted. All right, so those are our 6 vocabulary words that I want you to focus on this week. Now that you've heard a little bit about them, head back to your vocabulary activities and get started.